The Japanese soldier is not the dope we thought he was before Pearl Harbor. He's not the Superman we thought he was when he was marching down through Singapore and Java and right onto Australia's back door. You've heard about his bonsai charges, his death for the Emperor, and his holding a grenade against his belly when he sees he's captured. Here are reports on him from men who have met him firsthand. That excerpt I just read comes from the introduction of a World War II era document titled Battle Experiences Against the Japanese, and I think it really illustrates how many Allied troops viewed Japanese soldiers as mysterious and unpredictable at the time. The Japanese soldiers fighting in World War II were known to be extremely cunning. They often fought while being outnumbered, under-equipped, and completely isolated, so they tried to level the playing field at all costs. They often relied on tricks to deceive, confuse, and kill Allied troops. From coconut bombs to impersonating Allied soldiers to convincing the Allies that their own artillery was shooting at them, today we'll look at the most common types of Japanese traps and tricks as documented by the men who experienced them firsthand. Let's get right into it, starting with the first category of Japanese battlefield tricks: booby traps. Setting traps for enemy soldiers was nothing unique in itself. After all, that's what landmines are. But the Japanese used traps far more extensively than most other militaries at the time. The Japanese knew that the soldiers they were fighting were very fond of souvenirs, war trophies, booze, really anything Japanese they could get their hands on that they could make use of themselves. So the Japanese often used those items to entice and kill Allied troops. In some cases, this was done by poisoning food or drinks and leaving them behind for the Allies to find. A US officer on Saipan reported, "The men had been warned against drinking the liquor found on Saipan until medical officers could test it, but these warnings were ignored in some cases. Some men became violently drunk while others died of what was diagnosed as wood alcohol poisoning." Wood alcohol is another term for methanol. The wood alcohol was found in bottles with burgundy labels. Common souvenirs like Japanese flags and swords were also often used as bait. A soldier fighting on the Admiralty Islands wrote, "The Japanese planted many booby traps using flags and swords. The usual plan was to place a landmine so it would be stepped on in an attempt to get the flag." In other cases, explosives were hidden within the items themselves. A US sergeant on Leyte wrote, "One of the men in my platoon got caught by an old trick. He found a Japanese pistol, but before he picked it up, he tied a hook on a string and pulled the pistol to him just to make sure it wasn't a booby trap. He took the pistol back to camp with him, and that night, when he snapped back the cocking piece, the pistol exploded and blew off his hand." As that report mentioned, the Allies were getting suspicious of traps like this, so the Japanese had to keep using more and more innovative traps to catch the Allied troops off guard. This led to some extremely innovative traps and bombs that were both ingenious and terrifying. Here's a report describing a few such traps. In booby trapping a phonograph, an electrical contact was set up by the Japanese so that moving the phonograph arm to play a record set it off. A radio was booby-trapped by removing all except one battery and filling the cavity with explosive. Turning the switch set it off. An artillery piece was booby-trapped by placing mines in front of and behind each wheel so they would be set off if the gun were moved. Parasols, flashlights, and pipes have also been booby-trapped. Another type of creative trap was the coconut bomb trap used on Leyte. One lieutenant wrote about this, saying, "The Japanese on Leyte used a large number of mines made by filling coconut shells with black powder. A hand grenade was embedded in the powder with a 5-second pressure detonator exposed. We soon learned to be particularly suspicious of coconuts lying on the ground around foxholes or scattered along the sides of roads and trails. Some were detonated by tripwires and others by pressure. On a few occasions, the Japanese put these coconut bombs on the end of a 3-foot fiber rope, whirled them around, and threw them as hand bombs. They made a terrific explosion, but did little damage. Some Japanese troops even made use of captured grenades for booby traps. Most Allied grenades were equipped with a spoon that could be held in place to keep the grenade from detonating after the pin was pulled. This was intended as a safety feature for troops throwing the grenades, but it ended up making them perfect for booby traps, as this report explains. The Japanese have taken a British or American grenade, pulled the safety pin, and placed it in the fork of a tree in such a manner that the tree holds the release handle down. A tripwire is attached. When the tripwire is hit, the grenade is jerked from the tree fork and detonates. The Japanese troops were also masters of their environment, and they were accustomed to jungle fighting. They often used their natural surroundings to their advantage when creating these traps. In addition to placing grenades in the forks of trees like that last report mentions, they found ways to use their natural environment to camouflage and conceal their booby traps. One soldier noted, "There have been a few instances in which vines were used as tripwires by the Japanese. Trails used a lot should be kept as clear of vines as possible. Remember, the Japanese soldier likes to plant mines in rear areas." Troops in the Pacific soon learned that nothing was off limits when it came to these Japanese booby traps, even if it meant using their own fallen comrades in the traps. A report from Guam reads, "The Japanese booby-trapped many of their own dead, placing grenades in the armpits or under the body." It's hard to imagine what daily life was like for the men on the receiving ends of these brutal traps. The Pacific Islands were nearly inhospitable to begin with, and in addition to all the natural factors they had to deal with, like brutal temperatures, poisonous snakes, and a lack of clean drinking water, troops in the Pacific had to assume that with every step they took, they could be walking into a new deadly trap that they had never encountered before. Like one of those reports mentioned, the Japanese became very good at sneaking behind Allied lines to plant these traps, so nowhere was safe for Allied soldiers. Guys, that was just the first category. Let's move on to the next type of vicious Japanese trick that was used against Allied troops: faking surrender or death. It was very rare for Japanese troops to willingly surrender during World War II, and the same reports documenting Japanese tricks and traps that we've been referencing include numerous accounts of Japanese soldiers choosing to end their own lives rather than be captured. Even though most Japanese soldiers wouldn't really allow themselves to be captured, they saw this as an opportunity to catch the Allies by surprise, and it was fairly common for Japanese troops to pretend to surrender or even die as a way to get Allied troops to let their guard down. Let's get into some examples of this from the war, starting with this report from the Admiralty Islands. Occasionally, a Japanese soldier would come in with his hands up in surrender. When close enough, he would arm a grenade which had been concealed in his hand and hold it until it exploded. Thus, he would injure as many as possible while killing himself. That was one of the most common ways that Japanese troops would pretend to surrender, since they often figured that if the situation was hopeless and they were going to end their own lives, they might as well try to take out Allied troops in the process. Other times, they would coordinate these fake surrenders with other troops to inflict even more casualties. One US soldier reported, "The Japanese soldier came out of a pillbox with his hands raised in surrender. As 5 of our men went after him, other Japanese in the pillbox shot 3 of them." On the Solomon Islands, an even larger scale plan was reported. A Japanese captain of a labor battalion walked into division headquarters and surrendered. He said his battalion would surrender and could be brought in if a detail were sent for them. A colonel and 20 men went to the specified position. As they stepped ashore, they were all killed except a sergeant, who was wounded. The sergeant made his way back to headquarters, and a force wiped out the ambush position by an attack from the rear. Instead of a labor battalion, it turned out to be a special weapons detachment, 200 strong. These tactics weren't limited to the typical Japanese soldiers either. Another Solomon Islands report says, "Several Japanese nurses walked up to our wounded with their arms raised. When close at hand, they threw grenades among the soldiers." Understandably, these tactics made Allied soldiers extremely hesitant when taking enemy prisoners. Troops quickly learned to make surrendering Japanese soldiers strip naked before allowing them to get close to make sure they weren't concealing a grenade, handgun, or knife due to how common these types of attacks had become. Faking death was another trick that the Japanese troops commonly employed to get close to the Allies. A British report stated, "Ambushed Japanese soldiers often drop and feign death by laying still for long periods." A US report from Attu made a similar observation. "In the thick of the fighting, every pile of wounded and death had to be examined for men feigning death and awaiting only the opportunity to snipe or throw hand grenades at our men, including hospital personnel seeking to give them treatment." That last bit about targeting medical personnel wasn't unique to this trick, and that'll come up in some later reports as well. Before I move on to the next category, I want to quickly say that if you enjoy these historical videos and want to support my work on this page, please consider picking up one of my merch shirts. Just click the merch link in the description or use the YouTube product shelf, and you can choose from the Pistol Packin' Mama shirt, which I designed after customized bomber jackets worn by the crew of the World War II B-17, nicknamed Pistol Packin' Mama, the Blasted Event shirt, which is based on this B-24 of the 487th Bomb Group, or the Paper Doll shirt, which which is designed after this Easy-8 Sherman tank of the 68th Tank Battalion that rolled into Germany in 1945. The shirts are super nice. They're printed by Bunker Branding, the company started by YouTuber Demolition Ranch, and buying them really helps support my ability to keep putting out videos like this. Okay, now let's move on to the next category of Japanese battlefield tricks: drawing Allied fire. The Japanese came up with some pretty crafty techniques to convince the Allies to shoot at them. Or at least the Allies thought they were shooting at them. The Japanese would often create decoys to draw Allied fire, thus revealing the positions of Allied troops and keeping the real Japanese positions hidden. One report wrote, "To bring down artillery fire and thus locate our guns, the Japanese have been sending patrols to light fires. It should be remembered that the Japanese soldier usually has very good smoke discipline. Smoke columns should be viewed with suspicion." In addition to using smoke, elaborate dummy positions were often constructed to draw Allied fire away from the real Japanese emplacements. Allied troops on Makin Island reported encountering some of these phony Japanese positions. A dummy anti-aircraft gun was a coconut palm log painted gray, with one end hollowed out to represent the muzzle. From 100 yards away, it appeared real. Dummy soldiers were found at another anti-aircraft position. They consisted of tree limbs nailed together with coconuts as heads and Japanese uniforms for clothing. This tactic must have been somewhat successful, as it's reported that a captured Japanese document stated, "Experiments on Munda proved that dummy positions and dummy guns were effective in drawing hostile artillery and bombing attacks. Always try to build dummy gun positions some distance away from our real positions." These diversionary tactics weren't just used for long-range fire either. The Japanese came up with a wide variety of methods to trick Allied soldiers into shooting at them, thus revealing their positions on the battlefield. Troops fighting in Burma shared this report. Japanese soldiers tied a length of rope to bushes and then moved to a place of safety. Then they pulled the rope to make opposing forces believe that enemy troops were moving among the bushes, thus drawing fire and locating positions. It's easy to see why Allied troops fell for many of these tricks. I mean, if I were a soldier fighting in the Pacific and I saw bushes start moving near enemy lines, I would absolutely start shooting at them unless I had heard of this specific trick beforehand. For the Allies, it became very important for troops to share this information with each other and to inform new replacements coming to the line of these tricks so they knew to keep an eye out for them. The Japanese often varied their methods as well, and moving bushes weren't the only trick used to draw small arms fire. Here's another report from Makin Island. One night, Japanese snipers worked their way into tree positions close to the perimeter. About dawn, they dropped firecrackers. The sound resembled Japanese rifle fire, and several of our men exposed their positions by firing. The Japanese snipers then opened up on them. Our men soon learned to listen for the hiss, which precedes the explosion of the firecracker. In other situations where firecrackers weren't available, the Japanese had to find more creative ways to make the Allies think they were being shot at. Corporal J.S. Stackis, a Marine fighting on Guadalcanal, had this to say. "When short of ammunition, the Japanese get bamboo and crack it together to simulate rifle fire when they want to draw our fire and find our positions." Like we mentioned earlier, using the dead to trick Allied troops was a common tactic, so it shouldn't come as a surprise that the Japanese sometimes used their own fallen comrades to draw Allied fire, like in this report. The Japanese once took the body of one of their slain soldiers, tied it to a pole, and exposed it in an open space to draw our fire and locate our positions. Pretty grisly stuff, but nothing was off limits during the savage fighting in the Pacific. Now that we covered the tricks the Japanese used to draw Allied fire, let's move on to the next type of trick: baiting soldiers into position. The tactic of getting your enemies in a specific location so you can ambush them definitely wasn't unique to the Japanese, but I think they came up with some of the most creative and often ruthless ways of accomplishing that. Earlier, we covered the use of fires to attract Allied artillery, but the Japanese came up with other uses for fires as well. A US officer on Saipan stated, "The Japanese would start small cooking fires in a little valley or near some caves. Attracted by the smoke, our troops would proceed, expecting to surprise the Japanese preparing a meal. Instead, these patrols would be ambushed by the Japanese waiting along the trail." In other cases, the Japanese would give up their own positions to lure Allied troops into an ambush. A soldier fighting on Bougainville said, "One trick the Japanese used was to fire several rounds from from a pillbox to disclose its position to our troops. When we advanced to knock out the pillbox, we would be met by flanking fire from machine guns concealed on both sides of it. Similar to the booby traps we covered, objects would sometimes be used to lure Allied troops into the sights of Japanese soldiers. This report from Saipan mentions how the Japanese would target souvenir hunters. Decoys were used by the Japanese who hid in the caves on Saipan. They placed a Japanese sword or rifle near the cave opening to attract souvenir hunters. The trick worked. And yes, just like some of the other tricks we covered, this trick often involved using dead bodies as well. Troops in New Guinea reported these Japanese tricks. They dragged one of our own dead close to our lines and propped him up, expecting that a group of our troops would be sent to rescue him. They placed captured weapons in front of our troops for the same purpose. Unfortunately, the depravity didn't stop there. This other New Guinea report describes one of the most vile methods used by the Japanese. A favorite Japanese trick is to capture a wounded man and place him near a trail or perimeter. Then they cover him with machine gun fire. They will torture him until he screams or yells for help, but it is absolute suicide to send help for him. All of these tricks have been brutal, but that has to be one of the worst we've covered. Let's move on and get into the next type of trick. Speaking English or impersonating the Allies. This was a common one. It's pretty typical for soldiers at war to learn a few phrases of the enemy language so they can tell them to surrender or something like that, but the Japanese took this to a whole different level during the war. Some Japanese troops became quite proficient at speaking phrases in English without any type of accent, and other Japanese troops went to even further lengths to impersonate Allied troops. In the last section, we covered that the Japanese would sometimes try to lure out Allied troops by torturing captives, but according to this report, that was sometimes tried without any captives at all. Sandwiching in a few words of English, a group of Japanese screamed and yelled to give the impression that American soldiers were being tortured. The idea was to attract American troops to the scene to be mowed down by fire. In other cases, the Japanese would use much more direct approaches to get Allied troops to expose themselves. I heard our captain, who had been wounded by a sniper, call to Lieutenant Miller of the 3rd Platoon. "Have you been relieved, Miller?" Then I heard a Japanese soldier say, "Come out, Miller." I decided not to give any more orders by yelling. While that trick didn't work in that particular instance, Japanese troops often went to great lengths to familiarize themselves with the way that Allied troops communicated so they could impersonate them, often successfully. An Australian report stated, "A Japanese soldier, camouflaged as a tropical bush, crouched for 2 days on the edge of an Australian jungle outpost. He learned names and nicknames. One day, in a perfect Australian accent, he called out, 'Say, Bill, where are you? This is Alf.' When Bill shouted in reply, the tropical bush suddenly arose and shot him dead. This sniper was wounded and captured only after the area had been completely raked by machine gun fire." Despite the fact that it was a war crime to target medics, Allied medical personnel were not immune from these tricks. A U.S. sergeant on Bougainville stated, "Japanese have a habit of shouting in English to full American troops. In one case, the Japanese shot some of our soldiers and then yelled, 'Medics!' When aid men rushed up to the wounded, the Japanese started to pick them off." Not only would the Japanese sometimes speak English to attempt to lure out Allied troops, they would also use this method to keep Allies from shooting at them during attacks. A report from Makin Island says, "One of our men in a foxhole one night heard a voice calling, 'Don't shoot, don't shoot.' He held his fire and the Japanese soldier who had called out in English jumped into his foxhole and attacked him with a pickaxe." On Guadalcanal, the 5th Marines were confronted by yet another clever Japanese trick. Colonel Merritt Edson reported, "One night the Japanese put down smoke and yelled, 'Gas!' We were green at the time and 2 companies withdrew, leaving 1 company exposed on both flanks." Due to the prevalence of these Japanese tricks, the Allies began using code names while communicating to keep the enemy from gaining intelligence or impersonating soldiers. A period list titled "Musts for the Jungle Soldier" stated, "If he is to survive, it must be second nature for every jungle soldier to memorize and invariably use the unit's selected code words for leaders, various set maneuvers, ammunition, medical aid men, etc." In addition to language, the Japanese also made attempts to mimic Allied signals, sometimes with mixed results. One U.S. officer reported, "When our units signaled with colored flares, the Japanese fired flares of the same color, hoping to confuse the attackers. The Japanese were unaware of the exact meaning of the prearranged signals, and the ruse failed." Some Japanese troops even took these tactics a step further, disguising themselves in Allied uniforms. One report stated, "In a battle on Biak, a tank momentarily lost the fire protection of its supporting tank. At that moment, a Japanese soldier in an American uniform climbed on the tank tank and dropped a grenade inside. In other cases, when the Japanese didn't have access to captured uniforms, they used other means to disguise themselves. A New Guinea report reads, "They wore cutout circular boards over their caps to simulate Australian hats." Other disguises were used as well in hopes of avoiding suspicion from Allied troops. A report from Leyte describes a particular instance of the Japanese dressing as civilians. Once, about 30 Japanese soldiers dressed as Filipino women and approached our position. When they were within range, they started throwing hand grenades. Tactics like that made it hard to know who to trust, and naturally, after attacks like that took place, Allied troops were suspicious of anyone they encountered, regardless of whether they were wearing a uniform. Now that we covered that, let's get on to our final category of tricks: intimidation and confusion. I'll start by sharing this report from a regimental commander in New Georgia who shared this report about the Japanese. In their bonsai charges, they even employed loudspeakers with phonograph records of battle noises. For a lot of the tricks we've covered, I've mentioned that I've heard of other armies using similar tricks on the battlefield, but I have to say that's the first I've ever heard of an army playing battlefield noises through speakers during an assault. I believe this was just done to intimidate the Allied troops and maybe to bolster the confidence of the Japanese soldiers who were charging into almost certain death. Soldiers also reported this other Japanese trick meant to scare and confuse Allied troops. On one instance, firecrackers with slow-burning fuses were dropped behind American lines by airplane to simulate the presence of Japanese troops. That's the second report we've heard today of the Japanese trying to use firecrackers to trick the Allies, and that one kind of reminds me of the Allies' use of Rupert dolls to trick the enemy on D-Day. Those Rupert dolls were meant to trick the Germans into thinking they were paratroopers being dropped behind their lines, and they were sometimes equipped with pyrotechnics like firecrackers to trick the Germans into thinking they were being shot at. But enough about that Allied trick, we're here to talk about the Japanese. This next Japanese trick was a common one used by the Germans as well, and it was meant to stop Allied artillery barrages. As a regimental commander on New Georgia reported, "We would try to help our neighbors, but no matter how carefully we coordinated our fire and obtained clearances, someone was certain to yell, 'For God's sakes, quit, you're shooting up our troops.' Generally, this was due to the Japanese practice of firing mortars at any located point in our area whenever any of our concentrations were brought down. Our new troops were unable to distinguish this from our own artillery, and the result was just what the enemy wanted. All our artillery would be stopped until every gun could be checked." A report from Burma shared a very similar tale. In Burma, while our artillery was firing on a close-in target, the Japanese opened up with mortars, timing his fire so the bursts of our shells and his bombs were as nearly simultaneous as possible. Not only did that make his mortars hard to locate, but also he hoped to make our infantry believe their casualties were caused by short rounds from our guns. I think that one might be the most clever trick we've covered. It's easy to see why troops would think that it was Allied artillery that was hitting them during an Allied artillery barrage, and I have to imagine this worked fairly often at stopping barrages when it was executed properly, especially when it was used on less experienced troops like the report stated. Alright, lucky for you guys, or rather unlucky, I saved the worst for last. I think this is probably the most depraved and cowardly tactic used by the Japanese, and it isn't even really a trick. This report comes from Makin Island. One night, soldiers in a foxhole heard a child crying in the woods ahead of them. They held their fire, and a native family, a man, a woman, and a child, came towards them from the direction of the enemy. A few Japanese were trying to use them as a screen and were driving them forward with bayonets. The men lay quiet, letting the natives come through, and then shot the Japanese. Japanese soldiers often showed little regard for human life on the battlefield, whether that was the lives of the enemy, of local civilians, or even of themselves. I hope this video helped to put the sheer brutality of the fighting in the Pacific into perspective, and hopefully now you have more of an appreciation for what those men on the front lines actually went through. I know that I certainly do after reading all those reports. If you like this video or learned something from it, please subscribe to see more, and maybe I'll cover some tricks used by other nations in future videos. I certainly have plenty of period reports of tricks being used by all sides during the war. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.